Hey everybody, welcome back. And in this section, we're going to talk now about the second kind of mainstay in the outboard gear that you would find in an analog studio and what we're going to find in our virtual analog studio, and that is compressors. So unlike EQs, compressors are a little bit more involved, and typically in a real world analog studio, most studios would tend to have more outboard compressors than they would typically have EQs. Again, EQs, most of the heavy lifting was done with normally on the board, or in our case, the channel strip, with a couple of exceptions to maybe some Pultecs. And we talked about maybe an Eve and maybe an API, so on and so forth, but there's probably only three. And as I said in the last section, I try to limit myself to no more than 3 or 4 outboard EQs or plug-in EQs beyond the channel strip that I can sprinkle around the session as need be to create that more unique flavor and style. Well, compressors are exactly the same way. So I kind of take the same approach, is that I take a piece of paper and I kind of limit myself to a limited amount of outboard compressors. Now, typically in I guess maybe like a mid high-end studio, because we may as well try to pretend like we're in a real high-end analog studio, right? Why not? We have the plugin. So typically, there's going to be a set of kind of compressors you're going to find in most studios. Most studios, you're going to find 1 or 2, maybe LA2A compressors, which we're going to take a look at all these in a minute, so have no fear. You'll typically have a pair maybe of 1176 compressors. Sometimes you'll have as many as 4 because they make a couple of different models of the 1176, the black face and the blue stripe, which we'll take a look at both of those. So I limit myself to say 2 1176s, whether it's a blue or a black face. I also allow myself, if needed, to take a DBX 160 compressor, which is a pretty famous hardware compressor used a lot on bass, guitar, kick drum, and drum buses. Also, if the studio was lucky enough and it had a little bit of a budget, you may even be lucky enough to find a Fairchild compressor. The Fairchild compressor is probably one of, if not the most sought after hardware compressors ever made. The hardware version, if you tried to fetch one today in the used market, if it was in halfway decent condition, you can pay upwards of $35,000 to $45,000 because it is a large piece of gear. It has anywhere between 15 and 18 tubes inside of that piece of gear, and it's just, again, like the holy grail of compressors. Most studios, if you had a mid or lower end analog studio, wouldn't even have a Fairchild, but in our example, I'm going to allow myself to have a Fairchild because a Fairchild sounds amazing, and we'll listen to some of that as well. So we're going to limit ourselves to 1 Fairchild compressor, and then also a pair of LA3As, which were a little bit different than the LA2A. A lot of studios would use those for things like electric guitars they sound really good on. So we're going to take a look at that as well. So if I look at my sheet of paper here, I have myself 1 LA2A, 2 1176s, 1 DBX 160, 1 Fairchild, and 2 LA3A. So that gives me 5 different types of outboard compressors that I can use to sprinkle around the mix to make certain tracks stand out and highlight and sound more unique. So it's the same concept as we talked about the EQs. If we only had 5 outboard compressors, we had to make a decision on where am I going to put these 5 compressors if I was going to use them all. So for example, we have 1 LA2A. So if we only have 1 LA2A, we can't put it on 5 different tracks. We can only put it on one element of the mix. And we have to decide as an engineer, where would that best be suited? Now, every mix is going to be a little bit different. And over time, you're going to develop instincts and kind of a style where you're just going to know that an LA2A sounds really great on a couple of different sources in particular. Bass guitar is one of them. Vocals is another. Background vocals is another. It could be worked on anything, but those are typically where they tend to be the most effective. But if you only have one, you have to choose where do you put it. Same thing with the Fairchild. Now, the Fairchild sounds great on anything, but again, where do you want to put it? We only have one. You guys get the idea. I keep harping on that point because that's super important, because again, just like I said in the last section, the tendency is to put these compressors across all of our tracks because they sound so good. And that defeats the whole purpose and is the reason, one of the reasons, why at the end your mixes don't sound like your favorite records, because that's not the way it was done in an analog studio, because you were limited to the amount of hardware that you had. Again, most of the heavy lifting was done by the channel strip or by the SSL board in our case. So let's take a look at some of these compressors. Now I have dozens and dozens of compressors, but what I'd like to do in this section in this series is give you 4 or 5, the ones that we kind of just mentioned, show you those, I have them by a couple of different manufacturers, and just show you a nice rounded out collection of compressors that you may want to have for your collection, because there are so many compressors on the market by so many manufacturers. It could be extremely overwhelming if you're new to this. So I want to give you a couple of options and alternatives. And as I said before, you could go out and demo all of these plugins from the manufacturers, and so then you don't have to spend any money. But we're going to listen to some sound examples. So let me shut up for a second here and let's move on. So the first we're going to look at, let's take a look at first our master bus. Okay, now on master bus, I tend to use, there's a few different types of compressors that I'll use, but I'm just going to show you one here because we are running an SSL, kind of a template here throughout the series thus far. On the master bus, I'm using the Waves SSL G bus compressor, which is the famous mix bus compressor of the SSL E-Series console. And this is a great compressor. Again, this is part of the Waves SSL bundle that you can get on sale a couple of different times throughout the year. You can't, as of this, the recording of this video, buy this separately. They only come in the bundle. However, I have seen times where they offer the channel strip as a separate plugin, you know, not having to buy the whole bundle, and they may do that as well with this one here. Now, the way this kind of works here, it's laid out kind of easily. We have a ratio button down here. We have an attack time, a threshold, a makeup gain, a release, and a rate of fade out, and that's really it. And what's great about the SSL mix bus compressor is that you just have to kind of kiss the needle. And when I use mix bus compression, I typically do things with very, very minimal amounts of compression. So as you can see here, I have this set to a 2-to-1 ratio, very light compression. My attack time is pretty slow. We're not hit. We don't want to cut the whole transient off and cut all the punch out of the song. And then I just dial back to maybe 1 to 2 dBs of compression, and then my makeup gain is at 1 dB of makeup gain with a very quick release. So thus far, what we're listening to here is just drums. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the drums, the bass, the piano, which is what we've been listening to this entire time up to this point, and then I'm going to let you listen to what this mix bus compressor will do. So here we have drums, bass. Here's our 2 electric guitars and our piano. And let's just loop a section here just to give you a feel for what this mix bus compressor can do to your mix bus. Now, again, we still have the tape machine, the console, the channel strip, all dialed in from the last sections, as well as on the snare, we left the Pultec EQ from the EQ section, the last section we did. We left the Pultec on the overheads from the last section as well, and that's pretty much it. So the only 2 pieces of hardware outside of the 3 main foundation plugins is the 2 Pultecs on the drums. Everything else is exactly the same as it was, and the vocals right now are muted. So here is, let's open up the SSL again. And on the master bus, just so you know, we have the mix bus from the VCC set on the Brit 4KE, which is the SSL. We're going to look at our mix bus compressor here, and then we also have the virtual tape machine. Again, this is all the same as it was throughout this series thus far. So here is our SSL. So let's play back a loop here and let's hear what it sounds like. Okay, so hopefully you can hear there, and again, I'm going to tell you what to listen for. Listen for the electric guitars in particular. When I bring in this compressor, all of a sudden things start to get a little bit tighter, a little bit thicker. Again, it's subtle. Once again, you should be listening to these on a good set of headphones or a good set of studio monitors. If you're listening to this on earbuds or an iPhone or some kind of lousy or cheap, very inexpensive speakers with compression, you're going to have a very difficult time hearing the difference, and you're going to say, I can't hear any difference. Well, part of that could be because you're not used to listening for compression quite yet because you're still in the beginning stages. And then if you are used to listening for compression and you understand how to hear compression and you can't hear it, it's probably your playback system. So be aware of that. These things are subtle. These are subtle things at this point. So again, listen for the snare, the crack of the snare. Listen for those electric guitars. When I bring in the compressor, you'll see we're only compressing a couple of dB. We only have 1 dB of makeup gain, so it's not really any louder, but the mix tends to get a little thicker. It just kind of tightens up a little bit, and that's what this compressor is known for. So let's play back the loop. I will start with it on, and then I'll bypass it. Okay, so hopefully you can hear the difference there. That mix gets nice and tight with this mix bus compressor. I love this thing. I love the way it sounds. Again, this is by Waves. If you can buy the SSL bundle, if you don't have a universal audio system, this is an awesome alternative. This whole bundle, the SSL bundle, is fantastic, like I've said a little bit earlier. But there are some other alternatives to mix bus compressors. The other mix bus compressor that you can use if you don't want Waves, or if you don't want to use universal audio, is if you can get the Slate Digital, it's not right here, the Slate Digital everything bundle. Sorry about that. Where you get if you get the everything bundle, they have a plugin that you can use here called the Virtual Bus Compressor Package, or the VBC. I'm going to turn off the SSL here. The VBC. The VBC by Slate Digital, you can buy as a standalone plugin where you get 3 plugins in one, and we'll take a look at all 3 here. Or you can buy the Everything Bundle, where not only do you get this plugin, you get all the plugins that Slate Digital makes, which is great. And at the recording of this video, it's about a $14 a month, US $14, to have every plugin that Slate has in their past catalog, and all the new updates and all the new plugins that come out every year you get for free. And he normally releases 2 to 3 plugins a year. So that's a fantastic deal. However, if you don't want to do that and you just want to buy the plugin outright, you could buy this plugin, I think, for about $149. Now, what's great about this plugin, and this is great for mix buses, is you have 3 plugins in one, and you can use all 3 at the same time, or you can just use one at a time. The top one here that we're first going to look at is called the FG Gray. Now, the FG Gray, oddly enough, is modeled after the SSL G-Bus compressor that we just looked at by Waves. This is modeled after that. Now, depending on what console that Slate modeled versus what console that the Waves company modeled, they're going to sound a little bit different from each other. They're not going to sound exactly the same. Now, one of the things I failed to mention a little bit earlier in this video, but I did in an earlier section, was when we think about these compressors, you got to think about this as they do more than just compress. All these compressors I'm going to show you, and all the compressors on the market, including your stock compressor, they all do one thing. They compress, right? But really the magic between differences between these compressors is the tone of these compressors. They sound, in some cases, radically different from each other. So as I said back in, I think, section 1 or section 2, when we talked a little bit about the history of analog gear and why it's so sought after and what's so great about it, and why would you have 10 or 15 or 20 different analog style compressors, is because when you have that many, and like our example, we're going to allow ourselves 5 or 6 pieces of hardware, you really have 5 or 6 totally different tone characteristic tools to shape the sound tonally a different way. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you right here. So here's our SSL. So we're going to set it to the same thing as we did before. We're going to use a 2-to-1 ratio. We're going to use a fast release. We're going to use a slow attack, okay? We're going to pull back our threshold. We're going to, our makeup gain is going to be we're going to put it up at like 1 dB, because we're only going to compress about a dB, okay? So here is the FG Gray, and we're going to dial back the threshold to get a dB or so of compression. Okay, Okay, so just like with the waves, when I get rid of the FG gray, you notice that the track kind of falls a little flat. When I bring in the FG gray, it gets a little more lively, a little more tight sounding. It's not really louder, although it appears to be a little louder because the mix tends to pull a little forward, closer towards you. That's what compression is going to do. It's going to tighten up, and it's going to kind of feel like it's sitting closer to you. But it's not really a volume thing. It's more of a tightness thing, and it's more of a tone thing. So again, listen for those guitars. Listen for the snare in particular. That's where you tend to hear it. And you'll hear it in the bass guitar as well. You'll hear the bass get a little thicker and rounder. So this is before. Okay, so hopefully you can hear the difference there. Now let's compare that to the second part of the second compressor in this particular plugin, which is called the FG Red, which is the Focusrite compressor. Again, another sought after piece of gear. This is made famous in a way by Chris Lord-Alge. Uses this all the time, along with his FG Gray or his mix bus. And so this, we'll set it to the same kind of settings. We'll do a 2-to-1 ratio. We'll do a pretty slow attack. We'll do a pretty fast release. Once again, we're going to make up gain about a dB because that's all we're going to kind of do. Now this compressor has what's called the drive knob. The more you push the drive, the little bit more of a harmonic distortion kind of a feel you're going to get. But I'm going to turn that off right now to compare apples to apples with the FG Gray. The high pass filter section we're going to leave off like we did on the FG Gray. The mix is at 100% just like on the FG Gray. And so let's take a listen to what this compressor does. Okay, so this has a little bit of a different effect. Again, we're only compressing about a dB or so, and that's typically what I do on mix buses, as I said a few minutes ago. But on this compressor compared to the FG Gray, and we'll toggle back and forth, the FG Gray has a little bit more aggressiveness on the electric guitars as opposed to the FG Red. Now, if I crank up the drive knob, that's going to change a little bit. And again, these things are subtle. The tonality differences here are subtle, but they're absolutely there. So again, make sure you're listening back to this on a good system. So now let's go ahead and I'll toggle between the FG Red and the FG Gray, just so you can kind of hear the difference. Listen to the snare, listen to the electric guitars. That's where they seem to be the most obvious. So we'll start with the FG Red, and then I'll turn that off, and I'll turn on the FG Gray, and you listen for the differences in tone. Again, think tone, think EQ. Don't think volume. Don't think compression. Think tone. Okay. Okay, so the FG Gray to my ear sounds a little bit more aggressive. It's got a little bit more bite to it. Again, we're only compressing about the same amount. I know it's not dead on exact, but it doesn't need to be. We're only talking about 1 dB of compression. The makeup gain on both compressors is exactly the same, but they sound different from each other. Okay, and again, that's the beauty of having all these different types of compressors, and that is the secret to mixing with analog style compressors. It's the tone. Okay, I'm going to keep saying that over and over, and you're going to want to throw the DVD out the window in a few minutes. But for my beginners that are not used to mixing with these kinds of plugins, or even my more experienced students that have these plugins that really don't understand what the advantages are. They just, they look cool. You see the needles move, something sounds different, and you kind of move on. But I really want you to understand and change the way you think about these kinds of plugins, because if you don't change your thought process, you're really missing out. And the more experience you have with these kinds of things, the more you're going to get more creative and clever with the way you use these. And again, you'll see that in the mixing part of the series, where you could be very selective because you'll know what these things sound like and where they sound their best. And then you can really highlight things in the mix while still achieving that compression. Now, a lot of times what people will do with this in particular plugin is they may not even do any compression at all. The other good secret about using analog style compressors is because they also model the input and output transformers. There may not be any compression at all, but just to pass signal through it does something to the tone. Now, again, it makes it a little more subtle. And that's not typically how I use them, but I know a lot of engineers that do, and it's effective. So that's the difference between the FG Gray and the FG Red. Now let's take a look at the last one in this particular collection. And this is why I like this collection, because you get 3 plugins in one. And if you're on a budget and you don't have any analog style compressors and you're looking for a budget-friendly way to get the most bang for your buck, this is a great alternative. Although we're going to look now soon at some universal audio ones as well. This is called the FG Mu. Now the FG Mu is an emulation of the Manley Mu bus compressor, I believe. Some people also say it's also a take on the Fairchild. They sound similar. This is more, again, of a tube-based style compressor, as opposed to the FG Gray and FG Red, which are more FET style compressors. And so this has a little bit of a 2K bump in it too, and this gets a little more smooth and a little more creamy and sounds much different than these other 2 compressors. So again, let's demonstrate that. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to use a pretty slow attack, a pretty fast release, and we're going to keep the high pass filter off. We're going to keep the mix at 100%. We're going to do the makeup gain again, maybe 1 dB. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and we're just going to leave the input at 12 o'clock, and we're just going to dial back the threshold to achieve about that 1 to 2 dB of compression. Okay, so hopefully you can hear that there, that the difference here is quite large in the top end. This has like a 2K kind of a bump in it, and as soon as you turn this on, it gets brighter, which is one of the reasons why I like this a lot. On my mix bus, I use this an awful lot. If you're looking for, if you have a track that's kind of dull sounding, and you always think you got to put an EQ on the master bus to kind of bump up the top end a little bit, you could do away with the EQ. You can use this. This works great, and it also is a compressor, and it adds a little bit of color and harmonic distortion. So now let me just toggle between the 3. I'm going to start with the FG Mu, then I'm going to go to the FG Red, then the FG Gray. A couple of times, we'll shut them back, turn them on and off. Again, just so you can hear the differences between the 3. Keep in mind, we're compressing all about 1 to 2 dB of compression. Our makeup gain on all 3 are set to the same. Our attack and release settings are set exactly the same, but the compressors react a little differently, and more importantly, they sound different. So let's start with the FG Mu. Okay, so hopefully that demonstrates well and kind of drives the point home. So we're gonna shut off the virtual bus compressor. I'm gonna turn the SSL one back on here. So now that's the mix bus. Okay, so those are the kind of the staples of the mix bus. Again, the VBC by Slate is great. You get the 3 compressors in one. The SSL G bus compressor by Waves or by Universal Audio is fantastic as well. There are others, but those are kind of the 2 that I kind of tend to gravitate towards more for mix bus, but you can experiment because again, they're all going to sound a little different. Now, when we talk about buses, again, like things on drum bus, I tend to use the same plugin. I love the FG Gray on drum buses. I think they sound great. I love the FG Mu on things like the master bus, like I was just talking about. So again, you can not only use this on the master bus, you can use it on your busing system as well. Or you can use these as single plugins. You don't have to have the whole rack up, and you can use them on individual tracks. Okay, so that's good. So if we talk just about our drums and turn on the FG Gray here, because before the FG Gray was across the entire mix. Now we're just doing it on the drums to kind of hear what it does just to drums. I love this on drums. Again, I always do about a 2-to-1 ratio whenever I'm talking about buses. And the reason for that is because if we remember what I've said throughout, again, slow attack, kind of a fast release throughout the series, is that you got to remember that along the way, before the drum signal actually hits this bus, now remember the drums are going through a tape machine, which has some compression on it, right? It's going through the VCC, the console collection, which has some compression. It's going through the SSL channel strip, which has some compression. That's 3 levels of compression. Now we're hitting it with the drum bus. That's going to be 4 levels of compression. And then at the end, it's going through the master bus compressor that we just looked at, and that's 5 levels of compression. That's why throughout all of this, I've been saying about compression, I like to do things in a very controlled fashion. Unless there's a reason to overcompress, most things 2 dB, 3 dB at most, because I know that I'm going to hit that compression in 3, 4, or 5 different stages throughout the mix. Again, that's another tip and another secret, and you should write that down as a note for yourself, is that you want to do things in a very controlled compression way. And that will, again, we'll talk more about this in detail in the mixing part of the series, because we're hitting it with compression along every step of the way. That's another kind of secret about being effective with these kinds of plugins. Okay, so let's listen to what this does on drums by itself. Let me go ahead and let's mute the rest of the track so you can really audibly hear what's going on here. We won't have the bass or the pianos going on. Okay, so let's take a listen to this. This is just the FG Gray. Okay, so hopefully there you can hear the crack of the snare obviously gets a little bit more present. The hi-hat gets a little more crispy. You can hear the kick drum get a little bit more punchy. It's not so pillowy sounding. And again, we're only doing about 1 dB of compression. We're just kissing the needle. We're doing what? Less than a dB of makeup gain and the drum stem to get a little bit tighter. Okay, this is a great compressor for drum bus. So that's, again, if you get this virtual bus compression, you can use it in a couple of different areas. So that's kind of our drums and what I like to do with drums. And again, you can experiment with different ones. This is a pretty common one I use for pop and rock and metal music. FG Gray on drum bus sounds amazing. Okay, now let's talk about some other different types of compressors, other options that you can check out. Now, as I said, to round out your collection of analog style compressors, because there are so many choices, I want to try to narrow this down for you. You want to have an LA2A style compressor in your collection, whether you use an LA2A or the FG401 by Slate Digital, which we'll take a look at, and there are others. But you want an opto style compressor in your collection, okay? Because that has a different tonality than things like the 1176 is another great type of compressor to have in your toolbox, okay? That's a FET style compressor. It's not a tube style compressor. It reacts differently to audio and it sounds different. You also want to try to have a Fairchild in your collection, and we'll take a look at a couple of examples of that as well. And if you have those three main ones, I think you're doing okay. Another option would be an LA3A, which again we'll take a look at, and maybe like a DBX 160. Having those 4 or 5 kinds of compressors in your collection, you have now a nice well-rounded toolbox of compressors that you can use that'll be super effective without you having to go out and buy 100 different plugins. Okay. Excuse me. So let's just take a look at some of those so you can see what they do and kind of hear them a little bit in action. So let's start with and we're going to take a listen, I think, to a lead vocal track here, because a lead vocal track is going to kind of maybe be a little bit more obvious and audible with some of these compressors. Okay, so the first one I want to show you, again, we talk about LA2A. I have a couple here. I have one by Universal Audio. This is the LA2A gray. Now, keep in mind with the LA2A, there were different versions of the LA2A over the course of the years. There was the gray face, which is this one. There was the LA2 before the LA2A, which was the first one, which is more of a silver face. And then there was the LA2A silver, which is the third version of this. And I have all three, but I'm just going to show you one. They all sound very similar, but slightly different. What's great about the LA2A is that it only has 2 knobs on it. It's got a makeup gain knob, and it's got a peak reduction knob. And that's all you need to worry about. The attack time, the release time, and all of that is already kind of preset inside of the circuitry inside. So you don't really need to worry about that as much. So basically you turn up the peak reduction to achieve the amount of compression that you want, and then you turn up the makeup gain to make up for the loss compensation, or compensate for the loss in volume. Pretty simple. So here's the LA2A by Universal Audio. I also have the LA2A by Waves. This is called the CLA2A, the Chris Lord Algae Collection. This sounds really good as well. And again, it's laid out exactly the same. We have a makeup gain knob, we have a peak reduction knob, and then down here with all Waves plugins, you have these little analog switches that kind of emulate the sound of 60 cycle hum and 50 cycle hum to give it a little bit more flavor, if you will. And then we also have this little high frequency knob here that kind of lets the high frequencies more or less, depending on how you turn this in, affect the reaction of the compressor, which is a little different than the Universal Audio version, but outside of that, they sound exactly the same. So what we're going to do is I'm going to play back this little vocal track here, this vocal section.
You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
Okay, so this lead vocal now is running through the same processor as before, running through the tape machine, the virtual console, and we're also running through the SSL channel strip here. And as you can see, I have a little bit of EQ happening here. I've brightened up around 3 dB at about 12K to give it a little bit of top end. I pulled out right around 900 hertz or so, about 3 dB, to get rid of some of that nasal in the voice. And then I'm actually doing a little bit of compression here. I have a fast attack here. I'm doing, again, about a 3-to-1 ratio here. And I'm just doing about 3 to 6 dB of compression.
Yeah. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
Okay, so you can hear with just the SSL all by itself how the vocal gets a little more present and it gets a little more even. Now, what I like to do on lead vocals, and again, you'll see this in the mixing series, is I like to kind of use the compressor on the channel strip to kind of level the performance of the vocal before I use a piece of outboard gear after that to give it more of that unique tone. Okay, that's another trick that you can use with instruments that are very dynamic, which typically vocals are. And you can see that by looking at the lead vocal track here. You can see that we have some peaks and some dips here. Okay, and that's just natural with any lead vocal, especially rock vocals, where you have you'll have maybe verses that are a little more subtle than choruses, and you have this very spiky up and down dynamic range. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to use the color and the compression. Okay, I'm thinking more of compression than color necessarily with the channel strip to kind of get a nice fast attack to cut down on that transient and to also pull the vocal a little bit more forward and to even out that dynamic a little bit. Okay, and then what I'll do after that is use some outboard compressors, and we'll do that in a second, to kind of give the vocal a little bit more compression, to even it out just a little bit more, but more importantly, to give it more color and more tone. Okay, so that's why I have two compressors here. Now, I only usually do this on vocals and background vocals. On all the other instrumentation, if I'm using an outboard piece of gear for compression, like an LA2 or an 1176 or DBX 160, I will typically not use the compressor on the channel strip, unless, again, the source material is very dynamic. If it's pretty even, or if it was recorded through a compressor on the way in, then I'm not really looking to level out the performance so much. I'm more using it for tone. Then I'll just bypass this, use the outboard compressor to give it that uniqueness. Okay, but we're on the lead vocal here.
You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
Okay, so about 6 dB of compression. Okay, now we're going to leave that on, and now we're going to take a look at, let's take a look at our LA2. Our LA2A by Universal Audio. We're going to turn this on. Now what I'm trying to achieve here is I'm just trying to achieve, again, I'm not trying to slam this thing to death, because this particular vocal, even though it's dynamic, it's not way out of control. And now we've already leveled it off a little bit with that with the SSL channel strips. Now what I'm looking to do here is just to give it a little bit more warmth and a little bit more vibe to it. Again, because I'm not using this compressor on any of the other tracks, it's going to give it that LA2 unique sound to it. So let me show you what I mean. And maybe I'll compress 3 dB, maybe 4 dB.
Yeah. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
Okay, so what you can hear there, we're doing about 4 dB, maybe 5 or 6 dB when she hits that chorus, is not only is it compressing more, but you should hear the vocal pull a little bit closer to you, and it kind of thickens up that vocal a little bit. When you get rid of the LA2, it kind of falls a little flat and it kind of sinks a little bit more back in the mix. And I'll show that to you when we turn the bass guitar, when we turn the rest of the band on, you'll hear the vocal kind of sit back in the mix a little bit, where the LA2 pulls it right forward, the LA2A pulls it right forward. And that's kind of the secret with this particular compressor. It's why I love it so much. Plus, because this is a tube-based style compressor, it's going to have a nice, warm, smooth top end. It's not going to be spiky on the top end. Okay, so that's important. So when you're using something like an LA2A or a tube-based style or an opto-style compressor, like the Slate FG401 Reds, it's based on this compressor as well, you're going to have a more rounded, creamy top end. It's going to sound a little more warm. Some people may say a little bit more dull, okay? It's also going to sound not like it's processed or compressed. You can push this thing pretty hard and it never sounds like you're squashing it. It always sounds pretty natural, and it's going to pull the vocal forward, which is what you want in the vocal. Okay, so we'll keep it on, and I'll toggle it on and off here with this power switch. You can kind of hear the difference. Hear how the vocal kind of pulls up forward towards us a little more.
You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
Okay, so hopefully you can hear that. Again, it's subtle, but it's certainly there. Okay, so that's the LA2A on a vocal. That's what that'll kind of achieve. Now let's turn on the rest of the band here before we move on to the next compressor. And let's just let's listen to the rest of the band. Let's listen to the rest of the band, meaning the drums, bass, 2 electric guitars, and piano, along with that vocal, so you can hear how the LA2A, I call it the LA2, but the LA2A will pop it through the mix.
Sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be.
Okay, so hopefully you can hear the difference here. Again, it's not a volume thing. When you lose the compressor, it kind of sits underneath the instruments a little bit. You kind of lose it. You lose some of the wording. When you bring in the LA2A, all of a sudden now the vocal kind of stands tall and stands on top of that mix a little bit more. Now, again, keep in mind, we haven't mixed this song yet. We're just doing demos here, right? We haven't dialed this in yet. When we dial this mix in later on, these are going to be a little bit more obvious. But hopefully you can hear the subtle differences in the audio there. Again, you're listening for how the vocal moves a little bit forward, okay? So that's the LA2. Now, in contrast to that, let's get rid of the LA2A. I keep calling it the LA2, but it's the LA2A. The LA2 is the first version of this, which has a much slower attack time, which we're not going to look at in this particular series, because I want to try to keep this simple so I don't overwhelm you. The thing about these analog plugins, it can get very overwhelming because, again, like I said, there's so many choices. Now let's take a look at the 1176, or one of the 1176s. Now the 1176, this is called the Blue Stripe. Okay, there's two versions of the 1170. There's actually several versions. I have two of them. I have the Blue Stripe, and then we also have, which we'll look at in a second, the Blackface. The Blackface, or the LN version, is the more popular one that you probably are familiar with, the black one. This is the Blue Stripe, okay? These totally sound different from each other, even though they act exactly the same. React exactly the same. They're both FET-styled compressors, or solid state. Unlike the LA2, they're not a tube-based compressor. They're not an opto compressor. Okay, so this is going to react a little bit differently. Now, the difference between the Blackface and the Blue Stripe from a tone point of view, which again is the most important thing here, is that the Blue Stripe has got a little bit more of an open top end, and the Blackface is a little more warm sounding. So depending on what your source material is, will depend on what you may use here. So we're going to start off with the Blue Stripe. Okay, and we're going to dial in. Now this, let's turn this on here. Now this has a few more controls in the LA2A. Okay, we have an input here. The harder we drive the input into the compressor, and we can compensate with the output. So if you drive it in and drive more signal, it's going to be a lot louder. You can turn down the output to compensate. Okay. We have an attack time here. All the way down to 1 is a slow attack. All the way up to 7 is a fast attack. Same thing with release. We got a slow release and a fast release. Here we have a ratio. We have a 4-to-1, an 8-to-1, a 12-to-1, or 20-to-1, which will be limiting. We'll just stick on 4-to-1. And then we have our meters here, okay? And so let's just dial in about the same amount of compression, 3 to 5 dB of compression here.
To be the man you used to. You can't stand I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
So you could see how much harder if I push the input, how much more compression you get.
You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to.
So you can see with the attack, as I turn down the attack and make it a slower attack, you don't get as much compression, right? The faster you turn up the attack, it's going to cut down on that transient, and it's going to give you a little bit more compression. Now, depending on the vocal, will depend on where you kind of set this. I'm going to set this right around a medium style attack because the first word of all her phrases is kind of jumping out at you, and we want to kind of catch those a little bit. And the release, we're going to set it kind of more of a faster release.
You can't stand I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
Okay, so this is a little more subtle than what we had on the LA2 on this particular vocal track. You can hear it get a little bit more open on the top, and it evens out the performance a little bit more, but it's not as obvious as the LA2. Okay, so the thing about using these compressors is you got to experiment depending on your source material. Okay, now if we were to do the same thing, let's bring in the band, just so you can kind of hear what it's doing with the band. Oops.
You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment.
Okay, so this has a little bit more open of it. You can hear it a little bit more in context with the band. It has a little bit more of the top end of her vocal gets a little more open. Okay, and you can push this thing a lot harder than we did on the LA2, and it doesn't sound compressed. It doesn't sound squished. Again, remember, we're using compression on the channel strip already, right? So we're already kind of compressing this. So we're just using this more as a tone box more than anything else. Okay, so that's this one. Now let's just take a look at the let's take a look at this one as well. We'll bring up the blackface now, and then we'll compare the two. Okay, so we're going to bypass this one. We'll turn on this one. Now let's set it to the same kind of settings and see what we kind of get. Let's see if it sounds any different.
I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
Okay, so right away you should be able to notice that with the exact same settings on these two compressors, watch the two needles, how they react. How much more, little more compression you get from the blue stripe than the blackface. The blue stripe reacts a little bit quicker, and we're setting it to the same attack time and the same release time.
Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to.
And you can see the input is set exactly the same, and so is the output. So it's interesting to see how they react a little different. So let's shut off the blue stripe altogether.
You can't stand I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
So this particular compressor, you get that it's a little more open in the lower mids as opposed to the high ends. It's a little more open sounding, but at a lower register frequency wise than the blue stripe. Is a little bit more open on the top. Okay, so let me toggle back and forth between the two so you can hear the both. So we're going to start off with the blue stripe, and I'll bypass, and we'll go back and forth.
You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to.
So hopefully you can hear that difference. Definitely the blue stripe is more open on that top end. So in this particular case, and again, this song is not really mixed, I would lean more towards the blue stripe because I want that vocal to cut a little bit more. But if you notice that it doesn't really sound compressed, again, it doesn't sound like we're squishing and we're pumping and breathing. It sounds natural, okay, which is great, which is what's, again, one of the things that's great about these plugins is that they don't sound like they're over compressed. So those are the differences between these two particular plugins. Okay, hopefully you could start to understand now why they both do the same thing, but they all have a different tone to them. Okay, so that's the 1176. Now let's also take a look at a couple of other examples. And again, if you don't have the universal audio version, what was I going to show you here? You can pick up the Waves version, which is the CLA 76. Now the CLA, excuse me, 76 is great because you get two plugins in one. You get the blackface, the LN version, or you can click this thing bluey and you get the blue stripe. So you get two plugins in one. So again, if you don't have universal audio, which are two separate plugins, the Waves version gives you the blue and the black all in the same plugin. Now we'll listen to this in a second and show you how they sound a little different from the universal audio ones. Take a look at the CLA 76 on this particular track here. So I'm going to get rid of the universal audio ones and just let you listen to the CLA ones because they do sound a little bit different because, again, they were modeled after different hardware units. These were modeled after Chris Lord-Alge's personal hardware collection, where the universal audio ones were modeled after their particular 1176s. And the thing to keep in mind about hardware is you can have two exact 1176s sitting in front of you, two separate pieces of hardware, and they're going to sound different. They're going to sound similar, but there's going to be difference between those two physical units because of all the circuitry in those are going to have different tolerances. They're going to be different ages. They're going to have degraded over time at different rates, so they're not going to sound the same. Again, going back to, and I'm going to keep saying it, these things have a sound to them that's different, and this is what you don't get with stock plugins. This is why these things are so powerful, because stock plugins, they're very transparent sounding, and a stock compressor sounds exactly the same no matter what stock compressor you use. With this, it's much different. So let's take a look at the blue stripe here. Let's kind of set it the same way. So we took off the universal audios. Let's hear this vocal.
You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
So again, it has a lot of the same characteristics as the universal audio version. It tends to be a little more open on the top ends. Now, what I find between the Waves versions and the universal audio versions, when you compare them side by side, which I've done, and we'll do that in the mixing series, I'm not going to do that in this video, they sound very similar. To me, to my ears, the universal audio versions tend to have a little more depth to them. The Waves versions always tend to be a little more colorful sounding, a little more hyped. Not better or worse, it's just a little bit different. I tend to lean towards the universal audio ones because that's what my ears are used to after all these years. The Waves versions of these plugins, the reason why I only own them, to be totally honest with you guys, is because with all the teaching that I do, these are great for instructional purposes. And the reason why I have all of the Waves counterparts to the universal audio plugins is more for teaching purposes and more for giving you an alternative to having to go out and buy a universal audio hardware system. Okay, and I've said that a bunch of times throughout this series. I'm not saying that the universal audio ones sound better than the Waves, although I prefer them a little bit more. All the Wave stuff sound great too. So if you don't have the budget to buy all the hardware with universal audio and the plugins tend to be more expensive and you want a more budget-friendly alternative, the Waves is a great alternative. However, if you have the budget and you want to invest in Universal Audio, and if money wasn't the option, wasn't the restraint, it was which one would you rather have, I would tell you go with the Universal Audio, because I think they sound a little bit better, but also because, again, like we said early on in this series, these will tax your CPU. The Universal Audio ones will not, because it runs off the DSP chip in the hardware. Something to keep in mind. Okay, so now if we go to the Blackie, same settings.
Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
You can hear there, just by me flipping back and forth without touching any of the knobs, how the Blackface sounds a little bit warmer. It just does. That's just like the Universal Audio version. And you'll notice we don't get as much compression. We'd have to push this a little harder on the input.
You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't.
So just watch the meter here. Watch the needle, just how it reacts on the Blue Stripe as opposed to the Blackface. And listen to the tone difference. You'll hear that the Blackie will get a little less bright, a little more warm.
Likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
Okay, so there's the difference in the CLA 76. Again, wonderful plug-in. Makes that vocal push right out in front, but it doesn't sound compressed, and it has a nice warmth to it depending on which version of this that you're using. Okay, now let's take a look at one more here. And again, we're staying on the lead vocal because it tends to be more audible. Let's take a look at the Fairchild. So again, the Fairchild is the other kind of the other compressor that you could have in your collection as far as plugins go if you have the budget to do so. The Fairchild, again, is the most sought after hardware compressor in the world. Here is the Universal Audio version. This is the mono version called the 660M mono. And again, this is a tube-based style compressor like the LA2A, but it reacts different to the audio. The hardware version had, I think, 15 or 19 tubes in it, a ton of tubes, a ton of transformers and circuitry that really added a lot of richness and color, more so than the LA2. And again, anything you put through it sounds great, especially vocals. So you basically have an input gain here, a threshold, and this thing called time constant, which kind of gives you different variations on the attack and release. Okay, so, and there's a bunch of presets you can always pick as well if you really wanted to. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this, and then we have an output here to make up the difference for the compression. And then we have a mix knob here where you can do parallel compression. I'm going to leave it on 100%.
Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to.
So on this compressor, it has a lot of similar characteristics to the LA2A. It sounds warm. It doesn't have that bright open top end. It sounds a little more warm, a little bit more smooth. That's what this compressor is known for. Now watch, we can push this compressor quite a bit. We're getting about, again, 3 to 5 dB of compression here, but I can really push this thing. And you don't really ever sound compressed. It seems like the more you push it, the better it sounds.
You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. You're sorry I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to.
So we're getting about 10 dB of compression there, and it doesn't sound like it's not pumping and breathing. It just sounds nice and smooth, and it levels out that performance a little bit more, and it just sounds like it just stands up front and it's just in your face, which is what we want. Again, and we've only turned up the makeup gain a couple of dB here on the output, and we're compressing about 10 dB. So I'll toggle it on and off and listen to how it just pulls forward and gets nice and thick and round.
You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
So you got you can stand, you may think. Without that compressor, those two words really pop out. But with this compressor, it cuts it in nice, but it doesn't sound, it sounds even. I'll turn it off and listen to that and listen to those phrases again.
You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
Then I'm not. Listen to that.
Used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
Hear the word not, how it now sits nice and even with the rest of performance, and it's not jumping out and hitting you in the face because this compressor's grabbing it and bringing it in, but it sounds natural. Okay, that's what's really special about this compressor. This compressor likes to be hit hard, and it doesn't, you usually got to be a little more conservative. This one, you can just slam it and it sounds great. So listen to the word not.
You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think.
Hopefully you can hear that demonstration. It really, really works really, really nice. And this is just a great compressor. So again, I would highly encourage you to try to get a Fairchild style compressor. These things sound great, and there's so much, they sound different from what we've listened to so far. Now again, if you don't have universal audio, you can always pick up the Waves version. Here is the Puig Child from the Jack Joseph Puig collection, modeled on the same kind, on his personal Fairchild. Okay, few less knobs on it, a little bit easier to look at, but the same kind of thing: input, threshold, constant, time constant, and output gain.
Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. You say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to.
So this one to me is a lot more subtle than the Universal Audio one. This is one of the compressors where I really tend to like the UA one more than I like the Waves one. The other ones are very similar and they're very close, and either one will do. This one, I tend to like the UA one a little bit better. This one seems a lot more subtle to me, even though we're pushing it kind of hard. But it's still grabbing those peaks on the word not, and it's not sticking out in front of you. It's making that performance nice and even, and it doesn't sound compressed. But this is another great alternative. And again, there's tons of presets on these things that you can go through, and you can play with the different time constants, so on and so forth. Like I said, you could go out and demo this for free for 14 days, and I urge you to do that. Get out the manual, play around with it, and listen to the different compressors. Okay, so that is the Fairchild by Waves. Now the last compressor I'm going to show you is we're going to take a look at this on some electric guitars. Another one of my favorites to have, and I think it would be great for you to have, is the LA3A. The LA3A sounds really, really nice on electric guitars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this over here to the LA3A. We have two electric guitars here, so we're going to set them for both. And this is, again, part of the Chris Lord Algae collection. Now what I'm going to do on the guitars, like I said before, I'm going to make sure that I'm not using the compressor on the SSL. Okay, I do that on vocals, but I don't tend to do that on other instrumentation. On electric guitars, especially distorted ones, we already have compression naturally from the amplifier. So I don't want to squash this too much. So let's set the LA3. I'm going to mute one of them just so.
You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me.
Okay, let me just set it for the other one now. So the thing about the electric guitars, like I said, because they're already got a lot of distortion on them, you want to be really careful with compression. I'm totally using this as a tone box and not using this as really the compress. We're going to compress very lightly here, just a couple of dB of compression, but I want you to listen to how much thicker the guitars get.
Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you.
Okay, so what you should be hearing there is the guitars, again, they get a little bit more compressed sounding, they get a little bit brighter sounding, and they pull a little bit forward in the mix. When you lose the compressors, the guitars tend to sink back a little bit. Again, it's not a volume thing, and there's a little bit of a tone to it. Now, we're only compressing a couple of dB. These are really, really distorted guitars, so you want to be very careful again. It just adds a little bit of color to it.
You may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to. You can't stand, I smoke and drink, and that I'm not what you may think. Sorry, I don't wear stilettos. I drink beer at your fancy parties. Your family most likely won't approve me. Say I hang out with boys too much. Your friends can't help but comment. You find it hard to be the man you used to.
Okay, so again, hopefully you can hear the difference where it pulls a little bit forward and it gets a little bit more of a finished, polished sound. The CLA or the LA3A is a great compressor for distorted electric guitars and even acoustic guitars as well. I mean, you can use others. This is a FET style compressor just like the 1176, but it's laid out just like the LA2A, but it's not a tube-based style compressor, so it sounds a little different. I use this a lot on electric guitars. This Waves version I really like. I also have the Universal Audio version, and unlike the Fairchild comparison, I like the the Waves version much more on electric guitars than the UA version. It adds a lot of nice richness to those electric guitars. And again, we're not slamming it at all. Okay, so that's another compressor that you may want to consider having, the LA3A style. So now again, in summary, we talked about if you wanted to know, well, what kind of, if I had to pick like a small little package of outboard compressors would you get for your plug-in collection? If you don't have any, I would say an LA2A style, whether it's Universal Audio Waves, or again, whether it's part of the SSL, or whether it's part of the Slate Digital collection. Remember, if you have the virtual mix rack collection, you also have the FG401 as part of that collection. This is an LA2A style compressor. Okay, so again, if you have the VMR and you have the Slate stuff, you kind of have all this stuff. Also having 1176s, we have 3 different types of 1176s in the VMR. We have the blackface, we have their own creation called a modern, and then we have a vintage, which is more like the blue stripe. So again, you get 3 1176s in this collection as opposed to maybe Waves Universal Audio. Again, you could demo all of these. So I would have an 1176. I'd have a blackface and a blue stripe of some kind. I like the Fairchild, which I think is fantastic. I think that's highly recommended. And then also an LA3A. So you're looking at an LA2A, an LA3A, a Fairchild, and a couple of 1176s. And right there, you have 5 different types of sounds that you can use across different tracks. And again, we'll look at more of this in detail in the mixing part of this series, but there's just some examples of different types of outboard compressors. And again, going back to what I said in the beginning, the key to all of this is making sure that you only limit yourself to, in our example, one LA2A. So we're not going to put it on all the tracks. We're going to pick what track we want it to be on. The LA3As, we're only going to have a pair of them. A pair of 1176s, maybe 1 black stripe, 1 blue stripe, or maybe 2 black stripes and 2 blue stripes, depends. And then a Fairchild, 1 Fairchild. By giving yourself those limitations and by picking where you want to put those in the mix, it can really highlight and make your mix sound more interesting. So I hope this was kind of a nice primer and a basic overview for compression that kind of gives you a little more insight and a little bit more things to think about when we talk about these analog style compressors. Again, we'll look at this much more detail in the mixing part of this series. But that's it for the compression section. So come on back for the next section where we're going to take a look now at some ambient things like reverbs and delays and show you a couple of things that you may want to consider and why I like the third-party analog style plugins for reverbs and delays.